The valley of Helm's Deep had seen war before. Its stones remembered the axes of ancient enemies, the screams of men who had come here seeking sanctuary, and found instead a grave with walls. But the men of Rohan who crowded its battlements on this particular night, cloaks soaked through, torches guttering in the cold wind rolling off the aired Nimrise, had never seen anything like what appeared on the deeping wall at the third hour after dark. There was no flash of light, no thunderclap, no sorcery that anyone could name or point to, though later, the scholar Gomling would write in his chronicle that the air had smelled briefly of salt and iron, of a sea none of them had ever visited. One moment the section of wall between the second and third Merlins was empty. The next, it was not. 300 men stood in perfect formation. They wore crimson cloaks that snapped in the mountain wind like battle standards. Their shields were round and bronze-faced, each one scarred with the memory of 100 engagements. Their spears rose in a forest of ash and iron above their heads, and their eyes, dark, clear, utterly without fear, swept the valley below, with the calm efficiency of men who had spent their entire lives learning how to read a battlefield and survive it. They were lean in the way that only relentless training produces, not the leanness of hunger, but of pure function, every ounce of them shaped toward a single purpose. At their head stood a man who looked as though he had been carved from the same rock as the fortress around him. Leonidas of Sparta was not a tall man by the measure of the Rehurim, but he had a quality that height alone cannot manufacture, the absolute, gravitational certainty of someone who has never once in his life doubted that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. His helm bore a transverse crest of horsehair the color of dried blood. His eyes were the gray of a winter Aegean, and they moved across the valley below with swift, methodical precision, cataloging everything. The torchlight spreading across the plain like a tide, the thunder of drums carried on the wind, the glint of 10,000 weapon points catching the firelight below. He turned to the nearest man, Dionysus, his most trusted captain, a soldier famous in Sparta for having said that if the Persians' arrows were so numerous they blocked out the sun, then at least they would fight in the shade. "We have been moved," Leonidas said. It was not a question. "Yes, my king." "By what?" "Unknown." Leonidas nodded once, the way a man nods when he receives information that is inconvenient but not catastrophic. He looked again at the valley. The drums were growing louder now, and the torchlight was resolving itself into something that the mind initially refused to process. Not an army in the conventional sense, but a mass, a tide, a geological event made of flesh and iron. Urukai, 10,000 of Saruman's finest, bred for a single purpose, marching in lockstep toward walls that Leonidas had already assessed in the 30 seconds since his arrival and found not disappointing exactly, but full of problems. The walls were high. That was good. The gate was reinforced. Also good. But the causeway approach was narrow in all the right ways, and the culvert at the base of the deeping wall was an obvious vulnerability that any competent engineer should have addressed 3 days ago. He filed that away. Aragorn found them first, because Aragorn was the kind of man who ran toward the inexplicable rather than away from it. He came along the wall at a pace just short of running, hand on his sword hilt. Legolas 2 steps behind him with an arrow already loosely nocked. The elf's eyes went wide, not with fear, which was not something Legolas experienced in the conventional sense, but with the genuine astonishment of someone encountering something that existed entirely outside his frame of reference. "Who are you?" Aragorn asked. His westron was direct, unadorned. A soldier's question. Leonidas looked at him for a moment. He took in the ranger's bearing, the quality of his blade, the way he stood, not in front of his men, but among them, which told Leonidas something important about the kind of leader he was dealing with. "Leonidas," he said, "king of Sparta." He let that sit for a moment, then added, with the faintest gesture toward the valley below, "You have a problem with your left flank. The culvert there," he pointed without looking, "has not been sealed. Whatever is out there, they will find it." Aragorn stared at him. Then he looked at the 300, still in perfect formation, crimson cloaks bright against the dark stone, and made the rapid, instinctive calculation that leaders make in desperate moments. "I do not understand this, but I understand what I see. and what I see is 300 men who are not afraid. Can you fight? Aragorn asked. Leonidas smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who finds the question genuinely amusing. That, he said, is the only thing we do. Below them, the drums stopped. For a single breathless moment, the valley was completely silent. Then the Uruk-hai began to move, and the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of them, and the torches spread across the plain like a burning sea come to swallow the world. Somewhere behind the walls, a child was crying. An old man was praying in a language older than Rohan. The defenders on the walls gripped their spears and their bows and their aging swords, and felt the specific, hollow terror of men who are brave enough to stay but honest enough to know they probably won't survive the night. The 300 did not grip their spears any tighter. They were already holding them correctly. Leonidas turned back to the valley and breathed in the cold mountain air. And for a moment, just a moment, he thought of Thermopylae, of the hot gates, of the narrow place where 300 men had held the world. He had done this before. If you want to see more legendary warriors dropped into the greatest battles of fantasy history, hit that subscribe button and drop a name in the comments. Tell us who you'd want to see fight alongside the greatest armies ever imagined. May the Force and the gods of Sparta be with you. Theoden King had ruled Rohan for years enough to know the difference between a man who claimed to be unafraid and a man who genuinely was. He had seen both. The first kind talked loudly in the feasting hall and went quiet when the swords came out. The second kind said very little, and when they moved, other men moved with them without quite knowing why. He knew within 30 seconds of meeting Leonidas which kind he was. They faced each other in the outer court of the Hornburg, torchlight throwing long shadows across the cobblestones. The sound of the approaching host a constant pressure against the walls, like a tide building behind a dam. Theoden was in his armor, old and proud, and carrying the weight of a king who had spent too long asleep and was still waking up. Around him stood Gimli, Hama, and a cluster of his household guard. Aragorn stood slightly apart, watching. Gimli was watching too, arms folded, head tilted at the angle he used when he was assessing stonework or enemies, which for a dwarf amounted to the same cognitive process. Leonidas had brought Dionysus and 2 other captains, Alpheus and Marin, brothers, both of whom had the disconcerting habit of finishing each other's sentences in the low murmur that Spartan soldiers used for tactical communication. The rest of the 300 remained on the wall, exactly where Leonidas had placed them, because Leonidas had placed them there, and that was sufficient reason. You come from nowhere, Theoden said. Not accusatory. Factual. Your dress is unlike any people I know. Your tongue is strange in my ears. He paused. And yet Aragorn vouches for you, and Aragorn's judgment I trust. Wise, Leonidas said. He reads a battlefield correctly. He glanced briefly at Aragorn, who received this as the compliment it was intended to be and nothing more. I will tell you what I told him. We came from a place you do not know, by means I do not yet understand, and I do not intend to waste the hours before battle trying to explain what I cannot. What I can tell you is this. He stepped to the rough map that Gimli had spread across an upturned barrel, a chalk sketch of the fortress, the deeping wall, the causeways, the culvert. He put one finger on the culvert without hesitation. This kills you. Before anything else, this must be addressed. Gimli shifted uncomfortably. We are aware of the drain. We had thought. You had thought it was too small for men to exploit. Leonidas did not say it unkindly. He said it the way a teacher corrects a student who has made an understandable error. It is not men you are facing. And even if it were, never assume a passage is too small until you have filled it with rubble and stood on the rubble yourself. He looked at Theoden. What do you have? Stones? Broken timber? Both, Hama said. Then start now. Every man not on the wall fills that culvert before the host reaches the gate. Every stone, every beam, every broken cart will you can find. He straightened. When it is done, it will not save you, but it will cost them time, and time tonight is the only currency that matters. Theoden studied him for a long moment. There was something in Leonidas that the king of Rohan recognized from his own bloodline, the ancient, stubborn, unreasonable insistence of a man who has decided that a piece of ground is worth dying for and has made peace with that decision so completely that fear has simply run out of places to stand. He had not seen it in a very long time. He had not been sure he would see it tonight. You said we, Theoden observed. You said we do not intend to waste ours. You speak as though this is already your battle. Every battle I am in, Leonidas said, is my battle. A silence. The drums outside had resumed, closer now. The deep, rhythmic thunder of them felt in the chest more than heard with the ears. Somewhere on the walls above, a man shouted something in Rohirric. That needed no translation. The enemy was deploying, spreading along the valley floor, filling the dark space between the mountains like water filling a vessel. Theoden made his decision the way good kings make decisions, quickly, completely, without the luxury of certainty. Tell me what you need. What Leonidas needed, it turned out, was very specific and very Spartan. He needed the gate passage, the narrow throat of stone between the outer door and the inner court. He needed confirmation of exactly how wide it was at its narrowest point. He needed to know the height of the walls on either side, the angle of the archer positions above, and whether the doors themselves could be resealed quickly if opened. He asked these questions in rapid sequence while walking the passage himself, running one hand along the stone, testing the ground with his foot, measuring distances with the particular unconscious accuracy of a man whose survival has always depended on knowing exactly how much space he had to work with. Dionysus walked beside him, and the two of them spoke in the low, clipped shorthand of men who had fought together so long that full sentences were a luxury they rarely bothered with. 40, perhaps 42 men across at the widest, Dionysus said. We will use 36. 3 ranks of 12. Room to rotate without breaking the line. The footing is uneven near the right wall. Second rank compensates left. Tell Alpheus. He already knows. This was Sparta, not the Sparta of legend and poetry, of marble temples and heroic verse, the real Sparta, which was a machine for producing men who could hold a line under conditions that would dissolve any other fighting force in the ancient world. The phalanx was not a tactic so much as a philosophy, the individual subsumed into the collective, each man's shield protecting not himself but the man to his left, the whole becoming something exponentially more dangerous than the sum of its parts. At Thermopylae, 300 men using exactly this logic had held the greatest army the world had ever assembled. For 3 days, they had killed perhaps 20,000 of Xerxes' finest before the end came. The Uruk-hai numbered 10,000. Leonidas had held worse odds. He returned to Theoden with his requirements stated simply. The gate passage was his. The Rohirrim would hold the walls and the keep. If the walls fell, when the walls were threatened, the men of Rohan would fall back through the gate, and the 300 would be waiting. And if the gate itself falls? Theoden asked. Leonidas looked at him with those gray Aegean eyes, and for a moment the torch shadows made his face look like something cut from stone rather than born from flesh. The gate, he said, will not fall. Outside, the drums reached a pitch that made the torches tremble in their brackets, and the first arrows of the Uruk-hai came arcing over the walls like dark rain. And the battle for Helm's Deep, already unlike any battle the fortress had ever seen, began in earnest. The arrows came first, as arrows always do, the opening argument of any siege. The enemy's way of saying we are here, and we are many, and we want you to know it before we kill you. The Uruk-hai loosed in volleys, disciplined and massive, black shafts filling the air above the deeping wall like a moving ceiling. And the men of Rohan crouched behind merlins and raised shields and prayed to Bhima and every other god they could remember the name of. The 300 did not crouch. They stood in their positions along the walls, fighting step with their shields raised at the precise angle, not flat, not vertical, but angled at 45 degrees, that deflected rather than absorbed, letting the arrow's energy bleed away along the bronze face, rather than hammering through it. It was the result of 10,000 hours of practice, this shield angle. It was the difference between a shield that lasted one battle and one that lasted 20. Around them, Rohirrim soldiers watched with the particular expression of men witnessing something that makes them feel simultaneously impressed and inadequate. Legolas was moving along the wall like water finding the path of least resistance. loosing shaft after shaft, with the fluid economy of motion. That made elves so unsettling to watch in combat. No wasted movement, no hesitation. Every arrow finding its mark with a certainty that looked less like skill and more like inevitability. He paused near a cluster of Spartans and watched them work for a moment. The way they communicated through pressure and position rather than words. The way the line adjusted itself constantly. Each man aware of the men beside him with a sensitivity that reminded Legolas, unexpectedly, of the way trees in a forest share root systems beneath the ground. Invisible connections making the whole stronger than any individual part. He filed this observation away and kept moving. On the causeway below, the Uruk-hai vanguard had reached the base of the wall, and the real business of siege warfare had begun. Grapples and ladders and the crushing weight of bodies pressing forward, each rank pushing the rank ahead of it into the defenders' weapons. The men of Rohan fought well. They were not cowards, but they were exhausted and outnumbered and laboring under the specific psychological burden of men who had already done the arithmetic and found it coming out wrong. And that burden expressed itself in the way they fought, reactive, slightly desperate, each individual making his own decisions rather than operating as part of a coherent system. Leonidas watched this from his position at the head of the gate passage and said nothing. The walls were the Rohirrim's ground. He had his ground. He was content to wait for the moment when the two problems would become one problem, because they always did. Every battle reached a point where the plan met reality, and the two had to negotiate. And what happened in that negotiation determined everything. The moment came sooner than even he expected. The explosion was not like thunder. It was bigger than thunder, deeper, a sound that seemed to originate not in the air but in the stone itself, as though the mountain had cleared its throat. The culvert, partially filled, not completely, because there had not been enough time and not enough material, detonated in a gout of green-white fire that Saruman's engineers had packed into a device of sorcerous chemistry that no one inside the fortress had anticipated or could have anticipated, because it had no precedent in the experience of any living man or elf or dwarf in Rohan. The deeping wall shuddered. A section of it simply ceased to exist, replaced by a column of smoke and falling stone, and the briefly visible shapes of men, thrown upward by the force of the blast. The concussive wave rolled across the courtyard like a physical thing, staggering the defenders on the remaining walls, snuffing torches, sending loose stones skittering across cobblestones. Then the Uruk-hai came through the breach like water through a broken dam. What followed in the next 4 minutes was, by any objective measure, controlled chaos, the kind of situation that separates armies from mobs. Because an army has a plan for when the plan fails and a mob does not. The Rohirrim, to their credit, fell back in something resembling order, streaming through the gate passage in groups, the rearmost men fighting as they retreated, buying seconds with wounds and courage. Aragorn was among them, his sword moving in the close, efficient arcs of a man who has learned that the space inside a fortress gate is too narrow for heroics and exactly the right width for pragmatic lethality. Gimli was somewhere in the press, audible before he was visible, the sound of his axes against Uruk armor a rhythmic counterpoint to the general cacophony. They came through the gate in a rush, and the 300 were waiting. Leonidas had arranged them in the formation he had specified earlier, 3 ranks of 12, shield to shield, spears at the horizontal, filling the passage from wall to wall with a density of armed men that the eye initially processed as a solid surface, rather than individual soldiers. The first rank's shields were locked, each overlapping the next by precisely 1 hand span, the spear points extending past the shield rim at the height of an Uruk-hai's throat. The second rank's spears extended over the first rank's shoulders, adding a second layer of points. The third rank pressed against the second, adding weight and depth, ready to rotate forward when the men ahead of them tired. The retreating Rohirrim parted around the formation like a river around a boulder, streaming to either side and up the stairs to the keep's upper levels. And then the gap closed behind them, and the Uruk-hai hit the Spartan line. The sound was extraordinary. It was the sound of a wave hitting a cliff, not the crash of water on stone, which implies the water winning eventually through persistence, but the specific, final Declarative sound of force meeting something that has decided not to move. The first rank of Urukai, 20 or 30 of them, crashed into the locked shields at a dead run and simply stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The line flexed backward by perhaps 6 inches. Leonidas had accounted for this. The geometry of impact force distributed across 36 shields. And then it came back. And the spears moved. The Spartans did not hack or swing or strike in the individual, expressive way that most soldiers fight. They thrust. Short, economical, precise. The spear point in and out in less than a second, targeting the gap between armor plates. The exposed throat, the unprotected thigh. Each thrust was a decision, made 1,000 times in training until it was no longer a decision at all, but a reflex. The body executing what the mind had long since automated. The first rank thrust, the second rank thrust over their shoulders. The third rank leaned in. The Urukai died in numbers that seemed impossible in such a confined space. But there were 10,000 of them, and they did not stop coming. And the passage was slick now with dark blood. And the weight of the press was enormous. Not just the front rank, but the ranks behind them, each pushing the rank ahead. The sheer mass of the Uruk host trying to accomplish through physics what it could not accomplish through individual combat. The Spartan line held. But holding was not static. It was active, constant. A sustained act of collective will that cost something with every passing second. Leonidas fought in the front rank. He had always fought in the front rank. It was not bravado. It was Sparta's oldest principle. The king does not send men where he will not go himself. Because men will follow a king into the dark, but they will not follow a voice calling from the light. His spear had broken in the first minutes. They always broke eventually. And he had drawn the short Xiphos blade that every Spartan carried for exactly this contingency, fighting now in the press with the controlled, almost surgical precision of a man who has spent 40 years learning how much damage a short blade can do in close quarters. Above them, on the walls of the keep, Legolas watched the Spartan line hold and felt something move in him that elves rarely felt. Not surprise exactly, but a profound and genuine revision of what he had believed possible for mortal men. Gimli appeared at his elbow. "They're holding," the dwarf said, in a tone that managed to convey both admiration and the slight professional irritation of someone watching another craftsman do excellent work. "They are," Legolas agreed. "How long can they keep it up?" Legolas watched Leonidas drive his blade into the gap beneath an Uruk's chin with the calm efficiency of someone performing a task he has performed 10,000 times. Watch the line rotate. First rank stepping back, second rank stepping forward. The whole mechanism functioning without a single shouted order. And considered the question seriously. "Longer," he said finally, "than anything out there is going to be comfortable with." The rotation saved them. Not immediately, and not easily, and not without cost. But the rotation was the thing. The mechanism that separated what the 300 were doing from what every other defensive line in the history of Helm's Deep had ever attempted. Every 90 seconds, by Leonidas's internal count, the front rank stepped back and the second rank stepped forward. And the men who had been bearing the direct weight of the Uruk press for a minute and a half got 30 seconds of relative recovery, enough to clear their vision, reset their grip, rotate a shield arm that had begun to tremble. It was not rest, but it was the difference between a candle that burns down in an hour and one that burns through the night. The Urukai had no such system. They fought as individuals, which meant they fought with passion and ferocity and the particular terrifying energy of creatures bred specifically for violence. But passion and ferocity are consumable resources, and the passage was narrow enough that their numbers, their one overwhelming advantage, could not be brought to bear. 10,000 warriors were functionally useless if only 12 of them could reach the enemy at any given moment. And those 12 kept dying and being replaced by 12 more who also died. And the mathematics of this were beginning, slowly, to register somewhere in the collective Uruk consciousness as something other than a tactical problem. It was registering as something closer to dread. Leonidas could feel it in the quality of the impacts against his shield. Still ferocious, still dangerous, but with a new hesitation behind them. A microsecond of reluctance that had not been there at the start. He had felt this before. At Thermopylae, On the second day, the immortals had felt it, Xerxes' finest. 10,000 of the best soldiers the Persian Empire could produce, sent against 300 Spartans and bounced back like water off bronze. And somewhere in that experience, the immortals had discovered that they were, in fact, mortal, and it had changed the quality of their fighting in exactly this way. The hesitation was not cowardice. It was the involuntary physical response of a body that has learned, against all prior expectation, that the thing in front of it might actually kill it. Good, Leonidas thought. Let them learn. He rotated back, let Dionysus take the point, and used his 30 seconds to assess the situation with the rapid, unsentimental clarity that was perhaps his greatest tactical gift. The line was holding. The floor of the passage was so thick with Uruk dead that the enemy was having to climb over their own fallen to reach the Spartan shields, which was actually helping. Bodies made poor footing, and poor footing cost the attacker momentum and the Spartan defenders time. The walls above the passage were still in Rehurim hands. He could hear Legolas working above him, the whisper of arrows so rapid it sounded almost continuous. Aragorn had rejoined the fight on the stairs to his left, carving space with the focused intensity of a man who understands that every second he buys matters. But there were problems. There were always problems. Marin, one of the brothers, the left flank anchor of the first rank, had taken a wound in the thigh from an Uruk blade that had found the gap between his shield and the wall during a press. He was still fighting. He would keep fighting until he could not stand, because he was Spartan, and Spartans did not leave a line while they could still hold a shield. But his rotation timing was off by half a second now, compensating for the leg. And a half second in a shield wall was a crack, and cracks grew. Leonidas had already adjusted the spacing of the rank around him, closing the gap with the bodies of two men who had been in the second rank moments before. This was not a decision he had made consciously. It was the result of 40 years of warfare, condensed into pattern recognition. The body acting before the mind had finished forming the question. The second problem was the smell. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. The passage was enclosed, and 60 men fighting and dying in an enclosed space generates a specific atmospheric quality, iron and viscera, and the torch smoke. That had nowhere to go, that attacks the senses with an almost physical force. Men and used to it lost focus, lost the fine edge of concentration that kept them alive. Leonidas had trained his men in enclosed spaces for exactly this reason. He had made them fight in smoke. He had made them hold lines in conditions that civilians would have considered inhumane and Spartans considered Tuesday. They held their focus now, breathing through their mouths, eyes fixed on the shield of the man to their left as much as the enemy in front, trusting the collective more than any individual sense. The third problem arrived in the form of a sound from above, a deep, splintering crack that Leonidas identified before he consciously processed it. The sound of the keep's outer door taking sustained ram impact. He glanced up. The Uruk-hai had found a second approach, scaling the rubble of the breached wall and pressing toward the keep's upper entrance while the main force hammered the passage below. It was sound tactics, divide the defense, force choices, create gaps. He did not fault them for it. He simply recalculated. Dionysus, his captain, was 3 men to his right, rotating forward into the front rank. I hear it. Take 8. Stairs. Left. Dionysus did not say that leaves us with 28. He did not say 28 against 10,000 is worse odds than 36 against 10,000. He was Spartan. He understood that worse odds were still odds, and odds were what you worked with. He pulled 8 men from the third rank with 2 words and a hand gesture, and they were moving up the left staircase. Before the Uruk pushing the ram above had completed another swing, 28 Spartans held the line. The line held. Aragorn appeared at Leonidas's shoulder in the brief gap of a rotation, breathing hard, a cut above his eye that he had not stopped to address because there was nothing to address it with and no time to address it anyway. He looked at the Spartan formation, diminished now, but geometrically perfect. The spacing adjusted automatically to account for the missing 8 men, and then he looked at Leonidas with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, exhaustion, admiration, and the specific concern of a leader who has been doing arithmetic. We cannot hold this indefinitely, Aragorn said. It was not defeat. It was information. No, Leonidas agreed. He said it the same way he would have agreed that the sun rose in the east. As a simple fact, requiring no emotional response. Gandalf, Aragorn began. When? Dawn. He said dawn. Leonidas looked at the narrow slit of sky visible above the passage, black still, genuinely black. The deep black of a night that had not yet considered the possibility of morning. He made his estimate. An hour. Perhaps slightly more. Perhaps slightly less. He looked back at the Uruk line, which was reorganizing itself for another push. The bodies of its dead being dragged, back by the ranks behind, to give the next wave better footing, which showed an organizational intelligence that he respected, even as he noted it as a problem. They were learning, slowly, grudgingly, with the particular stubbornness of creatures not accustomed to being taught lessons, but learning nonetheless. The next push would be different from the last one, more coordinated, the weight distributed differently, trying to find the flex point in the shield line that they had not been able to find yet. They would not find it, but they would make the next minutes considerably more expensive. Leonidas rotated back into the front rank, displacing Dionysius' temporary replacement, and felt the familiar weight of the line behind him, the pressure of 27 men whose survival depended on the man to their left, doing exactly what they had trained to do, no more and no less. He felt Marin's timing in the line, still slightly off, compensating, holding. He felt the angle of the shields and the weight of the spears and the collective breathing of men who had survived 3 hours of continuous combat through the application of pure, distilled, unromantic discipline. Above them, through the stone, he could hear Dionysius' 8 men engaging on the stairs, the shorter, more chaotic rhythm of close quarters fighting without the structure of a wall. 8 Spartans adapting the phalanx philosophy to a staircase, holding the high ground with the stubbornness of men who had been told to hold it and saw no compelling reason to revise those orders. The Urukai massed for their push. Leonidas set his feet, felt the stone beneath him, solid, ancient, indifferent. The fortress did not care who held it. The fortress simply existed, and men fought and died in its shadow. And tomorrow, it would still be here regardless of the outcome. The way mountains are regardless of everything. He had stood in a place like this before. A narrow place, with enemies beyond counting, and a small number of men behind. Him who had decided that this ground was worth the price. He knew how that story ended for the men who held the line. He had always known. He raised his shield. Spartans, he said, and his voice in the passage was not loud, but carried to every man. Leonidas saw it forming. He had seen this before too. The enemy gathering itself for the blow that it hopes will end the argument, concentrating force like water behind a dam before the dam breaks. He watched the Uruk ranks compress and reorganize across the width of the passage approach. 300 warriors preparing to hit 23 men with everything they had. And he made the calculation that the situation required. The mathematics were simple. 23 men in a rotating shield wall could hold this passage against a sustained assault for another 30 minutes, perhaps 40, but a mass charge of 300, pressing with the full weight of the ranks behind them, would not be a sustained assault. It would be an impact event. And impact events follow different rules. The line would flex. The line would hold the flex for perhaps 15 seconds. And then, without the depth of bodies to absorb the momentum, it would break. And when the Spartan line broke, the gate broke with it, and the fortress fell. 30 minutes to dawn, perhaps less. He turned to the 23 men behind him and looked at them for a moment. Sweat-soaked, blood-streaked, standing in the ruin of 4 hours of continuous combat with their shields still raised and their eyes still clear, and felt something that Spartans were not supposed to feel and felt anyway, which was love, not sentiment, not the soft warmth of affection, the hard, clean, absolute love of a man for the people who have stood beside him in the worst places he has ever been, who have not flinched, who have cost him nothing he did not choose to spend. We are going to do something, he said, that is either very clever or very stupid. Dionysius, blood drying dark on his cheek from a cut that had stopped mattering hours ago, looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard this sentence before and knows that the answer is usually both. We are going to open the gate, Leonidas said, and we are going to go out. The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Alpheus said quietly, "Ah." And that was the entirety of the Spartan deliberation. Aragorn, who had been on the stairs and had come down at the change in the passage's atmospheric quality, the specific silence that precedes a major decision, heard this and moved forward. Leonidas. They are massing for a charge. 300, perhaps more, with the full weight behind them. In here, that charge kills us. Leonidas looked at him directly. Out there, we choose the ground. Aragorn understood tactics. He looked at the passage, looked at the gate, looked at the Spartan king, and did the geometry. The courtyard beyond is wider. Yes, too wide for a wall. But there is a natural choke point. Leonidas had identified it hours ago. During the initial assessment, filed it away. Leonidas saw it forming. He had seen this before too. The enemy gathering itself for the blow that it hopes will end the argument. Concentrating force like water behind a dam before the dam breaks. He watched the Uruk ranks compress and reorganize across the width of the passage approach. 300 warriors preparing to hit 23 men with everything they had. And he made the calculation that the situation required. The mathematics were simple. 23 men in a rotating shield wall could hold this passage against a sustained assault for another 30 minutes, perhaps 40. But a mass charge of 300, pressing with the full weight of the ranks behind them, would not be a sustained assault. It would be an impact event. And impact events follow different rules. The line would flex. The line would hold the flex for perhaps 15 seconds. And then, without the depth of bodies to absorb the momentum, it would break. And when the Spartan line broke, the gate broke with it, and the fortress fell. 30 minutes to dawn, perhaps less. He turned to the 23 men behind him and looked at them for a moment. Sweat-soaked, blood-streaked, standing in the ruin of 4 hours of continuous combat with their shields still raised and their eyes still clear, and felt something that Spartans were not supposed to feel and felt anyway, which was love, not sentiment, not the soft warmth of affection, the hard, clean, absolute love of a man for the people who have stood beside him in the worst places he has ever been, who have not flinched, who have cost him nothing he did not choose to spend. "We are going to do something," he said, "that is either very clever or very stupid." Dionysus, blood drying dark on his cheek from a cut that had stopped mattering hours ago, looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard this sentence before and knows that the answer is usually both. "We are going to open the gate," Leonidas said, "and we are going to go out." The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Alpheus said quietly, "Ah." And that was the entirety of the Spartan deliberation. Aragorn, who had been on the stairs and had come down at the change in the passage's atmospheric quality, the specific silence that precedes a major decision, heard this and moved forward. Leonidas. They are massing for a charge. 300, perhaps more, with the full weight behind them. In here, that charge kills us. Leonidas looked at him directly. Out there, we choose the ground. Aragorn understood tactics. He looked at the passage, looked at the gate, looked at the Spartan king, and did the geometry. The courtyard beyond is wider. Yes, too wide for a wall. But there is a natural choke point. Leonidas had identified it hours ago. During the initial assessment, filed it away for exactly this possibility, where the outer walls rubble has created a secondary narrowing, 30 feet past the gate. We form. There. They come to us. 23 men in an open courtyard. 23 men in a chosen position, Leonidas corrected. There is a difference. There was. Aragorn knew it. He looked at the Spartan king for a moment longer. And then he said, "I'm coming with you." "No," Leonidas said. "You are going to get on a horse." A pause. "The charge," Aragorn said slowly, understanding arriving. "Theoden. The fortress does not need to be held forever. It needs to be held for 30 more minutes." Leonidas looked at the slit of sky above. The black had softened infinitesimally. "When Gandalf comes, he will come from the east with cavalry. When cavalry hits a broken infantry formation from behind. It ends," Aragorn finished. "It ends," Leonidas agreed. "Your job is to make sure Theoden is ready to ride the moment the light crests that hill. Our job," he turned back to the 23, and something moved across his face. That was not quite a smile but occupied the same general territory is to make sure there are still enough of them out there to be worth charging. What happened next was witnessed by Legolas from the keep's upper ramparts, and he described it afterward in terms that caused even other elves, creatures of considerable age and experience who had seen the first age and the fall of kingdoms, to go quiet in a way that indicated genuine emotion. The gate opened. 23 Spartans walked out of it in formation, shields locked, moving at the controlled, quick march of men who know exactly where they are going and intend to arrive there having spent nothing unnecessary on the journey. They reached the rubble choke point in the outer courtyard, a narrowing created by the fallen stones of the breach, perhaps 20 feet across, and they stopped, and they turned, and they set. The Uruk-hai commander stared at them. He had been preparing a charge of 300 warriors against a gate. He now had 23 men standing in the open, in the early gray light of approaching dawn, shields locked, spear points forward, looking at him with the specific expression of men who have chosen their ground and intend to hold it until the ground itself dissolves beneath their feet. He did not understand it. He did not have a framework for it. In his experience, which was the experience of a creature bred for war and nothing else, when you were outnumbered 15-1, you did not walk out of cover. You did not stand in the open. You did not look at the enemy with that expression, as though the enemy was the one who should be concerned about the arithmetic. He ordered the charge because there was nothing else to do. The Uruk-hai hit the Spartan line in the rubble choke point, and the choke point did what choke points always do: it negated numbers, compressed the attack, forced 300 warriors to filter through a 20-foot gap in groups of 10 and 12 and run directly into locked shields and extended spears. The line buckled. It bent. 2 Spartans went down in the first 30 seconds, overwhelmed by the raw mass of the press. Alpheus took a wound across the shoulder. That would have taken a lesser man out of the fight and responded by driving his shield into the face of the Uruk who had given it to him and reclaiming his position in the line. The line did not break. It was not holding comfortably. It was not holding easily. It was holding the way a man holds a door against a storm, with everything he has, with every muscle and every ounce of trained response, and every last gram of the will that makes a Spartan, rather than simply a man with a shield. Leonidas fought in the front rank and felt the line's weight behind him, like a physical thing, 20 bodies pressing forward. And he used that weight, leaning into the Uruk press, driving the shield wall forward by inches. That cost immensely and were worth every cost. Then the light came. It crested the eastern hills in a wave. Not the gentle preliminary light of early dawn, but the full, sudden, almost aggressive brightness of a sun that had been waiting behind the peaks and now committed entirely, flooding the valley with gold so intense that the Uruk-hai on the hillside flinched and raised their hands against it. And in that flinch Leonidas heard what he had been listening for. Hooves, thousands of them. The deep, rhythmic thunder of a cavalry charge that had been building behind the crest of the hill and was now, finally, coming over it. Gandalf's white light blazed at their head. Eomer's riders spread across the hillside like a breaking wave. Theoden came through the main gate at the thunder of Aragorn's signal. 500 Rohirrim on horseback, crashing into the Uruk flank at the precise moment that Eomer's force hit them from behind. The Uruk-hai formation, already compressed and disordered by 4 hours of failed assault, and the 20 minutes of grinding attrition at the rubble choke point, did not survive the impact. It came apart the way formations come apart when hit from multiple directions. Simultaneously, not a retreat, but a dissolution. Individuals suddenly aware that the collective they had been part of no longer existed, finding themselves alone in a field of charging horses with nowhere coherent to go. Leonidas lowered his shield. Around him, 18 Spartans still stood. 5 were down, alive, badly wounded, but alive, already being tended to by the Rohirrim women who had come through the gate in. The cavalry charges wake with the practical urgency of people who understood that the fighting was over and the surviving had begun. The valley filled with the sound of the last resistance breaking, and then with a silence that was not empty but full of wind and distant hoofbeats and the particular quality of air after violence has passed through it and taken its toll. Dionysus appeared at Leonidas's left shoulder. His shield arm was shaking, not from fear, but from the sustained muscular effort of 4 hours of continuous combat. The body finally permitted to acknowledge what it had been doing. He looked at the valley, at the broken Uruk formation, at the dawn light spreading across the stones of Helm's Deep. "Messenger coming," he said. Theoden rode toward them, not at the gallop of battle, but at the measured walk of a king, approaching something he is not entirely sure how to address. He reined in 10 feet from Leonidas and looked down at him from the saddle. And then he looked at the 18 men standing in the rubble. And then he looked at the passage behind them. The passage that had held through the night, that had cost the Uruk-hai nearly 1,000 dead in a corridor of stone. He did not have words immediately. He was a king and a man of eloquence. But there are things that exceed the ready reach of language. And this was one of them. "Sparta," he said finally, testing the word like a man testing ice before he walks on it. "I have never heard of it." "No," Leonidas agreed. "I think," Theoden said carefully, "that I should like to." Leonidas looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the valley, at the morning light laying gold across the stones where 10,000 Uruk-hai had come and broken themselves against something that had refused, through the long dark hours, to be broken. "Another time," he said. "For now," he turned to his men, to the 18 standing and the 5 being tended, to Dionysus with his shaking shield arm and Alpheus, with his shoulder wound, and the rest of them, sweat-dried and blood-marked and standing, precisely as straight as they had stood at midnight. "We have wounded to see to." In the days that followed the Battle of Helm's Deep, the people of Rohan would speak of many things: Gandalf's arrival, Eomer's charge, Theoden's ride from the gate. They would speak of Aragorn's courage and Legolas's arrows and Gimli's axes. These were true things, worthy of song. But those who had been inside the passage, who had seen the gate hold through the night, who had watched the shield wall rotate without breaking for 4 unbroken hours, who had seen 23 men walk out of a gate they could have stayed behind and choose open ground because they believed in the choosing. Those people spoke of something else. They struggled to describe it because they lacked the language for it. They had no word for a rate. They had no word for the Spartan philosophy that the manner of a death matters as much as its timing, that a line held with discipline and will is worth more than a line held with twice the men and half the conviction. They found words eventually, the way people always find words for things that matter enough. They said, the men in crimson cloaks held the gate. They said, they did not retreat. They said, when it was worst, they walked forward. Leonidas and the 300 did not remain in Middle-earth. The same rift that had brought them, Saruman's shattered palantir, they would later theorize, cracking reality along some seam that was not meant to be opened, pulled them back 7 days after the battle, on a morning of clear sky and cold wind above the plains of Rohan. There was no dramatic farewell. Leonidas was not a man for dramatic farewells. He left one thing behind, in the stone above the gate passage, cut with the point of a Xiphos blade by a hand that clearly knew how to work stone as well as war, were 3 words in a script no scholar of Middle-earth could immediately read. Gimli translated it eventually, from a fragment of old stone-cutting language he half recognized. "Come and take it." The gate of Helm's Deep stood for 1,000 years after that night. No enemy ever broke it. Some said the stone remembered.